They're going to kill him today, and I brought them in. The creature you call Bigfoot saved my life by pulling me off the roof like a piece of fluff, and I repaid him by blabbing to my nephew. Now there is no forest outside the window, but a private army. They didn't bring a cage. They brought body bags and saws for dismemberment. I wanted to prove that he was real, and in the end, I just signed his death warrant. The steam from my coffee mug rose in a lazy spiral, momentarily obscuring the ruby-throated hummingbird hovering at the feeder outside my window. It was a ritual, this quiet observation, the centerpiece of a life meticulously rebuilt from silence and solitude. For the past 5 years since retiring, my life had been governed by these small, peaceful moments. The cabin, nestled deep in the coastal mountains of British Columbia, was my sanctuary, a structure of cedar and stone that had become an extension of myself. Its shelves were lined not with novels, but with geological surveys and worn textbooks. Its mantelpiece held not family photos, but a collection of agates and quartz crystals polished smooth by 1,000 years of river water. I'd spent a career deciphering the stories told by rocks, a profession of logic and hard evidence, and this solitude was the reward. The world of men, with its noise and ambition, its endless meetings and data sets, felt 1,000,000 miles and a lifetime away. I took a slow sip of coffee, the dark, bitter liquid of familiar comfort, the warmth spreading through my chest. Outside, the tiny bird, a fierce jewel of emerald and ruby, darted away from the feeder to chase off a curious chickadee, its territorial aggression a miniature drama against the vast, silent backdrop of the forest. It was perfect. A placid sea of contentment, earned over 40 years of hard work. I leaned back in my worn leather chair, content to watch the dust motes dance in the shafts of morning light, a silent symphony for an audience of one. And then, from the deep woods to the north, from the direction of the old-growth stands that had never known an axe, there came a sound that did not belong. It was not the crack of a falling branch or the cry of an animal. It began as a low, resonant hum, a vibration I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. The coffee in my mug trembled, its surface disturbed by tiny, concentric rings. The window pane rattled softly in its frame. It was a deep, guttural thrumming, like a colossal string on an unseen instrument being plucked. The hum held for a long, breathless moment before it was joined by the sickening crunch of immense pressure, a sound of catastrophic failure. It was the sound of something impossibly strong being broken, a drawn-out, grinding shriek of wood fibers tearing apart, followed by a final, percussive crack that echoed off the distant slopes like a gunshot. The squirrels went silent. The hummingbird vanished. Even the incessant whisper of the wind through the ancient Douglas firs seemed to die, leaving a vacuum in its place. The air grew heavy and still, charged with a sudden, primal tension. My scientific mind scrambled for an explanation, a localized earth tremor, a lightning strike, a massive deadfall. But I knew it was none of those. The ground had not shaken, and the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. A falling tree, even a giant, makes a sound of decay, of rot giving way. This was a sound of violence, of living strength being overcome. The perfect morning was shattered, its delicate peace replaced by a profound and unsettling sense of wrongness, as if the fundamental laws of my quiet world had just been broken. I spent the rest of the day in a state of low-grade anxiety, a dissonant hum beneath the surface of my carefully constructed piece. The memory of that sound replayed in my mind, an unwelcome and persistent echo. It was the unnaturalness of it that disturbed me, the way it had violated the known language of the wilderness. I tried to occupy myself with routine, cleaning my fly fishing line, sharpening the blade of my small axe, but my hands felt clumsy and my thoughts kept drifting north. My geologist's mind, trained to interpret the Earth's violent history through the silent evidence of strata and fracture, cycled through possibilities and discarded each one. It was not seismic. The ground had been firm. It was not a rock slide. The acoustics were all wrong, lacking the chaotic clatter of stone on stone. It was a sound of focused, torsional force, a singular event of immense power that had no place in the slow, patient life of the forest. That night, asleep was a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by dreams of twisting trees and a deep, resonant vibration that shook my very bones. The next morning, the sun rose into a sky of pale, indifferent blue, but the stillness it illuminated felt different, charged with the residue of yesterday's violence. I could not ignore it. The need to know, and the professional instinct that had driven me to the remote corners of the earth for 40 years, that was a deeper imperative than fear. Armed with a heavy ironwood walking stick that had been my companion on 100 expeditions and a deep-seated curiosity I could not suppress, I headed north. I left a note on the kitchen table, a habit from a lifetime of fieldwork. Gone to inspect the northern stand. Back by dusk. It was a message for no one, a ritual for a life lived alone, but it felt necessary. I moved toward the oldest part of the forest, a place the loggers had never touched, where the trees were titans that had stood for centuries, their canopies so dense they created a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. The air grew cooler here, thick with the scent of damp earth, moss, and decaying pine needles. After an hour of pushing through dense undergrowth, the familiar terrain giving way to a primeval tangle of salal bushes and sword ferns, I began to see signs. A young hemlock, its trunk the width of my thigh, was snapped in two, the break fresh, its pale wood exposed like a raw wound. A deep furrow, as if something impossibly heavy had been dragged, scarred the mossy ground. Then I stepped into a small clearing, and the source of the sound was laid bare before me. A colossal Sitka spruce, a tree that must have been 400 years old by the rings I could only imagine, was down. But it had not fallen. A fall is a surrender to gravity and rot. This was an execution. The base of its trunk, a solid pillar of wood thick as my truck, had been twisted and shattered. It looked as though a pair of giant celestial hands had gripped the ancient tree and wrung it like a wet cloth until its structural integrity failed in a catastrophic explosion of fiber and lignin. The wood, where it had splintered, was peeled back in grotesque pale ribbons, some as long as my body. It was an act of impossible force, a display of power that defied every principle of biomechanics I had ever studied. I walked the perimeter of the devastation, my boots sinking into the churned earth, my mind numb with disbelief. No storm could do this. No machine could have reached this remote place without leaving a road in its wake. As I completed my circuit, my gaze following the immense length of the fallen trunk, I saw it, and the impossible physics of the tree became a secondary concern. Beneath the crushing weight of the main trunk, and the deep shadow where the splintered base met the ground, I saw it. At first, my mind refused to process the shape, categorizing it as a burl of wood, a peculiar growth of moss and fungus. But the form was too deliberate, too symmetrical. It was not a bear or a cougar. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but it belonged to the forest itself. Its skin, if it could be called that, was a living mosaic of gnarled gray bark and thick, verdant moss that clung to it like a second skin. Its limbs were long and gnarled like the ancient roots of a cedar, impossibly thin in some places, and thick and powerful in others. It was pinned, its lower half trapped beneath the crushing tonnage of the spruce, its legs disappearing into the wreckage. From a severe wound high on its thigh, a dark, viscous substance, the color and consistency of pine sap, oozed slowly, staining the moss a deep, troubling black. It lay perfectly still, so still it could have been a part of the deadfall, a sculpture carved from the forest's own substance. But its head was turned toward me. The face was a landscape of bark and shadow, a thing that should not have features, but did. And in that face, 2 eyes, the color of dark, wet river stones, were fixed on me. They held no panic, no animalistic fear, only a profound, unnerving intelligence that stripped the air from my lungs. It was an ancient, weary, and deeply conscious gaze. It had watched my approach. It had observed my scientific examination of its predicament. It was watching me now, waiting. My scientific mind screamed in protest, a frantic internal monologue of denial and rationalization, searching for an explanation that did not exist. It was a geological anomaly, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by years of isolation. But my eyes, trained to observe and record empirical fact, could not be so easily dismissed. The evidence was right there, trapped and bleeding a substance that smelled faintly of resin and damp earth. This was a creature of myth, a spirit of the forest given form, a living being that had no place in the ordered, classifiable world I knew. And it was dying. The immense pressure of the spruce was slowly crushing the life from it, the dark ooze from its wound a testament to its fading vitality. I could not leave it. The thought of walking away, of leaving this impossible being to perish alone in the twilight of its own forest, was a violation of some fundamental, unspoken law. My humanity, or perhaps some deeper, more primal instinct, would not allow it. The decision was made not in my head, but in my gut. A silent, irrevocable commitment. I spent the next 2 days in a blur of frantic, exhausting labor. The first trip back to the cabin was a hurried, stumbling retreat, my mind racing to formulate a plan, to assemble the tools for a task that felt Herculean in scope. I brought back my heavy-duty truck winch, a powerful electric motor spooled with 100 feet of steel cable, its battery charged to full. I brought heavy logging chains, each link as thick as my thumb, and 2 hydraulic jacks, squat, powerful cylinders of steel and oil capable of lifting 20 tons apiece. The journey back and forth was an ordeal in itself, dragging the heavy equipment through the dense undergrowth, my body protesting the unaccustomed strain. The work was slow and perilous, a dangerous calculus of weight, leverage, and friction. I could not simply lift the trunk. It was too heavy, too deeply embedded in the earth. I had to shift it, to pivot its immense weight just enough to create the space needed for the creature to free itself. I began by anchoring the winch cable to another giant, a healthy Douglas fir that stood 100 feet away, wrapping a chain around its base to protect the bark. The electric motor whined, a high-pitched scream of protest in the cathedral like silence of the forest, as the steel cable grew taut, vibrating with immense tension. The engine of my portable generator, powering the winch, sputtered and coughed, threatening to stall under the incredible load. The spruce trunk did not budge. It was a lesson in humility, a stark reminder of the scale of the forces at play. I changed tactics, using the hydraulic jacks. I cleared away debris from beneath a section of the trunk, digging into the soft earth with my bare hands until I had a firm, flat surface. I positioned one of the jacks, the steel groaning as I pumped the handle, the pressure building until, with a sharp crack, the jack sank into the soft ground, its lifting power wasted. The entire process was a series of failures and recalibrations. I would gain an inch, only to have the trunk shift and settle, robbing me of my progress. I would then shove blocks of wood, scavenged from the shattered base of the spruce itself, into the gap I had created. A dangerous, nerve-wracking process of reaching into the crush zone, acutely aware that the slightest movement could trap me as well. I worked from dawn until the light failed, my body slick with sweat, my hands raw and blistered despite my work gloves. The entire time, the creature watched me. It never made a sound. Not a whimper of pain when the trunk shifted and settled. Not a cry of fear when a chain slipped with a percussive clang. It simply observed my toil with those ancient, unblinking eyes. Its stillness was unnerving, a stark contrast to my own frantic, noisy efforts. It was a silent witness to my struggle, its gaze a constant, unreadable presence. I began to feel as though I was being judged, my every action weighed and measured by an intelligence that operated on a different timescale, that understood the forest in a way I never could. On the evening of the second day, as the last rays of sun filtered through the canopy, painting the scene in hues of orange and deep purple, I made one final attempt. I had managed to create a small but stable cradle of wooden blocks, giving the jacks a solid platform. I positioned both jacks, their steel heads biting into the rough bark of the spruce. I worked the handles in tandem, moving from one to the other, the rhythmic clang of the pump mechanisms the only sound in the deepening twilight. The trunk began to lift, not just an inch this time, but a foot, the wood groaning in protest, the immense weight shifting with a final, shuddering groan. It was enough. The creature moved with a surprising quickness, dragging itself free from the space I had created. Its wounded leg left a trail of dark, sticky sap on the forest floor as it pulled its body clear of the wreckage. It pulled itself to a sitting position, leaning its back against a nearby rock, its long limbs unfolding from the cramped space in which it had been trapped. I stood back, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, and my muscles screaming from the unaccustomed labor. I leaned against my walking stick, breathing heavily, the air cool and sharp in my aching lungs. The creature looked down at its freed leg, a long, gnarled limb that was twisted at an unnatural angle. Then it looked at me. The expression in its riverstone eyes was unchanged, still unreadable, but the focus of its attention was absolute. It slowly extended a long, finger-like appendage, a thing of bark and moss that ended in what looked like hardened, polished wood. It reached across the space between us and gently touched the back of my hand. Its touch was cool and felt like damp soil and old bark, a transfer of the forest's own elemental essence. It was not a thank you, not in any human sense. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of my effort, a gesture that transcended language. Then, with a fluid grace that defied its obvious injury, it rose to its full, towering height. It limped, favoring its wounded leg, but moved with a silent, deliberate purpose into the deepest shadows of the forest, vanishing completely into the gloom. I was left alone in the clearing with the silent, defeated giant of a tree and the profound, unshakable knowledge that my world had been irrevocably changed. A month passed, a slow procession of quiet days that gradually eroded the sharp edges of the impossible event. The forest returned to its normal rhythms, the silence once again filled with the familiar chatter of squirrels and the rustle of wind in the canopy. My own life, too, settled back into its peaceful routine of morning coffee, long walks along the creek, and evenings spent cataloging my rock collection. I cleaned and stored the winch and jacks, their steel surfaces bearing the new scars of their extraordinary labor. As the days turned into weeks, I began to wonder if the entire event had been a hallucination brought on by solitude, a waking dream constructed by a mind starved of human contact. My scientific training reasserted itself, whispering rational explanations. Perhaps I had stumbled upon a fallen tree and, in mind forcing from the hike, had simply imagined the creature, my mind projecting a mythical cause onto a natural event. The mind is a powerful and unreliable narrator, after all. The only proof was the fallen spruce, a silent, irrefutable monument to a secret I could never share. I visited the site once more, a week after the event. The clearing was already being reclaimed, new ferns uncurling from the disturbed earth. The massive trunk lay exactly where I had left it, a testament to the reality of the forces involved. There was no sign of the creature, no track, no lingering drop of sap. It had vanished as completely as if it had been reabsorbed by the forest itself. I accepted the ambiguity, filing the memory away in a deep recess of my mind, an unresolved data point in the long, quiet survey of my life. Life settled back into its peaceful routine. The autumn rains began in earnest, a steady, gray drizzle that turned the forest floor into a soft, fragrant carpet of decay and new life. One afternoon, a sudden squall rolled in from the coast, a dark, bruised-looking mass of clouds that raced across the sky, far more violent than the gentle showers the forecast had predicted. The wind, which had been a mild breeze moments before, began to howl, whipping the trees into a frenzy. I had been meaning to fix a loose piece of flashing on the cabin's steep metal roof for weeks, a minor task I had repeatedly postponed. Now, with the prospect of a serious leak, the chore became urgent. I grabbed my tool belt and a handful of roofing nails and, with a grim sense of impatience, clambered up the ladder. The roof was pitched at a sharp angle, its corrugated metal surface slick with the first drops of rain. I moved cautiously, my heavy work boots struggling for purchase, the wind tearing at my jacket. I was on the cabin's steep metal roof, my knees braced against the peak, trying to hammer down the loose section of flashing before the deluge hit. The wind came in a sudden, furious gust, a solid wall of air that slammed into me, tearing the hammer from my grasp. I watched, helpless, as it cartwheeled through the air and disappeared into the ferns below. The force of the gust threw me off balance. My boots, which had been precariously perched, skidded on the wet metal. In an instant, I was sliding, gravity taking hold with a terrifying finality. I clawed for a handhold that was not there, my gloved fingers scraping uselessly against the slick, cold surface. My world narrowed to the rushing green blur of the ground and the rough, splintered ends of the firewood pile directly below. My life did not flash before my eyes. There was only a stark, cold certainty of the fall, a clinical assessment of the impending trauma. An 8-foot drop onto an unyielding pile of split logs. Broken bones were a certainty. A shattered hip, a fractured spine. The cold reality of lying helpless and broken in the driving rain, miles from any possible aid. It was a stupid, ignominious way to die. Just as my heels went over the edge of the roof, as my body tipped past the point of no return, as a force of incredible strength seized the back of my work coat. It was not a snag or a lucky catch on a nail. It was a grip, powerful and absolute, that arrested my fall with a jolt so sudden and violent it knocked the wind from my lungs. I hung there for a second, my body dangling in the air, suspended between the slick roof and the hard ground. The pressure on the back of my coat was immense, the fabric groaning under the strain. Then, with a steady, seemingly effortless strength, I was pulled back from the brink, dragged upward until my chest was once again flat against the cold metal of the roof. I scrambled on my belly, crab-walking my way back to the relative safety of the peak, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I straddled the ridge, taking deep, ragged breaths of the rain-lashed air, my mind struggling to catch up with the impossible physics of my rescue. When I had regained some measure of composure, I peered over the edge and looked down. The creature was there. It stood on the rain-soaked ground beside the woodpile, undeterred by the wind and the downpour. One long, mossy arm was extended to its full, impossible length. Its hand, a gnarled collection of root-like fingers, still clutching a fistful of the thick canvas fabric of my coat. It had reached up, a distance of at least 10 feet from where it stood, and plucked me from my fall as easily as I might pluck a leaf from a branch. It had saved me. It held its gaze for a long moment, its river-stone eyes meeting mine. In that shared look, there was a clear, unambiguous acknowledgement. There was no debt, no gratitude, but a simple, profound statement of fact. You saved me. I have saved you. The ledger was balanced. A gust of wind whipped a sheet of rain between us, and when it cleared, the creature turned. It did not run or retreat. It simply melted back into the downpour and the trees, its form dissolving into the gray, rain-streaked shadows of the forest until it was gone. I was left alone on the roof, and the cold rain soaking through my clothes, shivering not from the cold, but from the terrifying, awe-inspiring certainty that I was not, and had never been, truly alone. After the storm, the dynamic of my existence in the forest shifted. The balance had been restored, and the life I had given was repaid with my own. Our connection, forged in violence and trauma, now solidified into a strange and silent friendship, a communion that existed outside the bounds of language or species. It never showed itself so clearly again. There were no more dramatic rescues or face-to-face encounters. The creature retreated back into its profound secrecy, becoming once more a spirit of the deep woods, a presence felt, but unseen. But its presence was a constant, an undeniable undercurrent to the rhythm of my days. It was in the sudden, inexplicable stillness of the forest when I walked, the feeling of being observed not with menace, but with a quiet curiosity. It was in the way the jays would fall silent, and the way a deer would lift its head and stare intently into a thicket where I saw nothing but shadows. The wilderness was no longer a collection of flora and fauna. It was the habitat of a singular, watchful intelligence. Soon the gifts began to appear. I would step onto my porch in the morning, coffee mug in hand, and find them placed carefully on the weathered cedar railing. They were never left in the same spot twice, but their placement was always deliberate, impossible to mistake for a random act of nature. These were not trinkets, but things of the forest that it must have deemed valuable, objects of natural art curated by a non-human aesthetic. One morning it was a piece of quartz crystal, milky white and as large as my fist, and with a vein of pyrite running through it that glittered like fool's gold in the dawn light. It was impossibly clean, as if it had been washed in a stream for 100 years. Another day, I found a single, perfect hawk's feather, its edges sharp and unbroken, its brown and white bands stark and beautiful. It was laid lengthwise on the railing, a simple, elegant offering. Perhaps the most remarkable gift was a perfectly preserved trilobite fossil, the delicate, segmented body of a creature that had been extinct for over 250 million years, locked in a piece of shale. I, a geologist, had searched these same hills for years and never found a specimen so complete. It must have been washed out of some hidden creek bed, a secret place known only to the forest's oldest inhabitant. I understood this was a dialogue, an overture. To ignore it would be a profound act of disrespect. I began leaving things in return, placing them in the same spot where I collected my morning gift. My offerings were from my world, but I chose them with care, trying to imagine what might hold value for a being of bark and moss. I left a piece of driftwood I had found on the coast years ago, its form sanded smooth and silvered by the relentless action of sand and salt water. Its shape like a resting seabird. I left a small bee, handcrafted brass bell I had bought in a market in Nepal, its tone clear and pure. I tied it to the railing with a piece of twine, and for a day, its gentle chiming was a new voice in the forest's symphony. The next morning, it was gone. One afternoon, I left a single, perfect apple from the small orchard I kept, its skin a deep, polished red. The gifts were always taken, usually before the next dawn, and new ones from the forest were left in their place. This silent, respectful exchange became the new ritual of my life, a touchstone that grounded my days. It was a conversation conducted in objects, a sharing of worlds across an unbridgeable divide. The fear and shock I had initially felt, the terror of my fall and the awe of my rescue, were replaced by a profound sense of peace and wonder. The creature was not a monster, not a mindless beast. It was a neighbor, a fellow inhabitant of this small patch of wilderness, and we had, through extraordinary circumstances, arrived at a place of mutual respect. I was no longer just a resident of these woods, an observer looking in from the outside. I was a part of them, a confidant to their oldest and most secret inhabitant. The knowledge of its existence, of its constant, watchful presence, changed my perception of everything. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow that moved at the edge of my vision, every unexplained sound in the night was no longer a source of anxiety, but a potential sign, a subtle message in our shared, silent language. The solitude I had sought, and the quiet life I had built as a refuge from the human world, was now a shared communion. And in this strange, unprecedented fellowship, I had never felt less alone. My world had grown both smaller and infinitely larger. It was smaller in that my focus had narrowed to this cabin, this porch railing, this silent dialogue with a single, extraordinary being. But it was infinitely larger because the boundaries of what I believed to be possible had been utterly and completely erased. The world held mysteries far deeper and more profound than I had ever allowed myself to imagine, and I, in my quiet corner of the British Columbia wilderness, had been granted the privilege of living alongside one of them. The days took on a new texture, a richness that had been absent before. I found myself paying closer attention to the world around me, noticing the small details, the subtle shifts in the seasons, the intricate web of life that connected the smallest insect to the largest tree. I was learning to see the forest not as a collection of resources, but as a community, a living entity with its own rhythms, its own secrets, and its own consciousness. And I was, in my own small way, a part of that community now. A human element that had been accepted, acknowledged, and even, perhaps, valued. The exchange of gifts continued, a slow, patient conversation that unfolded over weeks and months, a testament to the strange and wonderful bond that had formed in the heart of the ancient woods. The loneliness I did not feel was a fiction, I told myself, a carefully constructed narrative to justify a life of chosen isolation. The silent communion with the forest creature was profound, a source of wonder that filled my days. But it was a communion of profound otherness. It could not replace the simple, flawed connection of human conversation. After a year of this strange, silent friendship, the isolation began to wear on me in ways I had not anticipated. I found myself talking to myself, my own voice startlingly loud in the quiet cabin. The silence, once a comfort, began to feel like a weight, a pressure in my ears. My nephew, Alex, a good-hearted but hopelessly modern young man who lived his life through the flickering glow of a screen, insisted on visiting. He was my sister's only child, and his sporadic video calls, full of pixelated concern, were my primary link to the world I had left behind. He was worried, he said. My voice sounded thin, my responses delayed. He imagined me wasting away, a lonely old man lost in the woods, and his youthful sense of familial duty compelled him to intervene. His visit was an intrusion, a disruption of the delicate rhythm I had established. His presence was loud, his phone a constant source of chimes and notifications that felt like small acts of violence in the tranquil air. He was a creature of the city, and the forest, to him, was a backdrop, a green screen for the digital drama of his life. He was bored within hours, restless and out of place. During his stay, on the second and final evening, in a moment of profound weakness and a desperate, aching need to share the wonder that had redefined my existence, I told him. Perhaps it was the whiskey I had poured, a rare indulgence, or perhaps it was the simple human need to be believed, to have my extraordinary reality validated by another. I told him everything. I told him about the impossible sound, the shattered spruce, the rescue. I described the creature, its bark like skin, its river stone eyes. I spoke of my fall, the impossible grip that had saved me, and the silent, ongoing exchange of gifts. To prove I was not a rambling, senile old man, I showed him the evidence. I laid the treasures on the rough-hewn wooden table between us, the quartz crystal glittering with fool's gold, and the flawless hawk's feather, and the perfect, impossible trilobite fossil. I swore him to secrecy, impressing upon him the profound importance of what I was sharing and the sacredness of the trust the creature had placed in me. He promised, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a boyish, unthinking excitement. The story, to him, was not a profound truth about the nature of the world. It was content. It was an incredible, viral-worthy tale. He saw not a sentient being to be protected, but a mystery to be solved, a monster to be captured on camera. He left 2 days later, promising again, with a hand over his heart, that my secret was safe, that he understood. I knew, even as he spoke the words, that he did not. He could not. His world had no room for this kind of mystery. Every unknown was simply a puzzle waiting to be unlocked and uploaded. A week later, my fears were realized. I found one of his gifts on my porch rail, placed in the spot where the creature usually left its offerings. It was a small, black, motion-activated trail camera, still sealed in its slick plastic packaging. A note, written in Alex's cheerful looping script, was attached with a rubber band. Just so you can see your friend. Cannot wait to see the footage. I stared at the small black box, a piece of consumer electronics that felt like a bomb left on my doorstep. It was a profound violation, a complete and utter failure to understand the nature of the bond I had described. He wanted proof, data, a shareable digital file. He wanted to reduce the sacred, silent dialogue to a series of pixels. I threw it in the trash, a cold, sickening dread creeping into my heart. I did not call him. There were no words for the depth of my disappointment, for the chasm of understanding that separated our worlds. I prayed that his casual, thoughtless intrusion would be the end of it. I prayed that the creature, with its ancient wisdom, would see the camera for what it was and simply avoid it, that our silent friendship would endure this clumsy, human blunder. This morning, as I sat with my coffee, the ritual felt hollow, and the peace of the dawn shattered before the day had even truly begun. I heard a new sound, a noise that had no place in the forest's lexicon. It was the high-pitched, insectile whine of electric motors. I stepped outside onto the porch and saw them, 3 of them, hovering like mechanical vultures high above the tree line. They were drones, their dark shapes stark against the pale blue of the morning sky. Their cameras, no doubt, panning across the canopy, searching. My blood ran cold. Then came the rumble of engines, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the soles of my feet. It was not the familiar sound of a logging truck on the main road miles away, but the close, menacing growl of heavy vehicles on the old, overgrown logging track that led directly to my property. I saw them through the trees, flashes of black and chrome where there should only be green and brown. 2 black, unmarked vans and a flatbed truck. On the back of the truck was a large, reinforced cage, its steel bars thick and newly welded. Men in dark, tactical gear, carrying rifles that were not for hunting deer, were fanning out from the vehicles. They moved with a practiced, disciplined efficiency spreading out into my forest, my sanctuary.
They carried long poles that ended in what looked like nets or snares. They were hunters, but not for any animal I could name. They were here for a specimen. I looked toward the deep woods, toward the north, toward the place where the ancient spruce lay, the place where our story had begun. A wave of nausea and self-loathing washed over me so powerful it brought me to my knees. I knelt on the rough wood of the porch, the world tilting around me, the taste of bile rising in my throat. Alex, in his excitement and in his desperate need to share, had not just told someone. He had told the wrong someone. He had posted it, a breathless, anonymous story on some corner of the internet dedicated to unexplained phenomena. He had described the location, my cabin, the strange geological formations, the unique flora. He had provided a map. And someone with resources, with ambition, with a complete lack of scruple, had listened. And I knew, with a certainty that hollowed out my soul and left a cold, dead void in its place, that I had just betrayed the single most profound trust I had ever been given. I had given them the map to a world they would only and ever destroy.